Hello and welcome to a new video. My name is Michael from the YouTube channel 3D Escape, and today I would like to introduce you to the render layers or to the render layer settings and show you all the settings you have available here, so masking and to exclude a certain layer on this little example scene here. And we will imagine that this is a fancy production for a feature film, and the guys from the post-production just said, please separate the spheres, the cubes, and the floor onto its own render layer, because we might, or we have to do some adjustments to these three groups. But before I dive into the settings here, I want to show you a little example scene I prepared, and there I used some render layers. Now we are actually in this scene, and you see a sphere and a cube on a glossy floor with a little bit of roughness, and you see these two color wheels here. So if I change the color, you see the cube changes its color as well as the reflection, and I can do the same thing for the sphere, and yeah, it works perfectly fine. And I rendered this image once with 6,000 samples, and now I have the possibility to change the color of the objects how I want, and I really like this blue greenish color. So this really light blue for the sphere, and the cube is maybe this greenish color. And yeah, this to have this possibility to change the color after you rendered the image is a really handy function to have. And you see this node setup for this, and yeah, I use two render layers to make this possible. You see, one with the sphere and one with the cube, but I won't go in depth here, because if you wanted to I can make a separate tutorial for this, but now I just wanna focus on the render layer settings you have available here so you understand the basics. As I said, we imagine this is a feature film production, and we need to separate the spheres, the cube and the floor to its own layer, so we can do some adjustments later on, whatever this is. Of course, this scenario here isn't that realistic, because they would give us some more information, so what passes they need, for example, so if they need a vector pass, for example, for motion blur. But now we want to just cover the basics with render layers, and this is perfectly fine for the beginning. So to start, I will move the spheres to its own layer, as well as the cube or the cubes. And when I enable the layers with Shift 2 and Shift 3, we have them a separate layer. And oh, one thing I forgot, this is how the scene looks like. So you just see the result. And now we need to add two more render layers. So one for the floor, one for the cubes, and one for the sphere. So floor, top, cubes, and spheres. And now we have to tell Blender which object is included in which render layer. And we already did the preparation for this. So we moved the plane onto its own layer, the cubes onto its own layer, and the spheres. And now we can easily tell Blender that should use the first layer for the floor render layer. The cubes render layer includes the second layer with our cubes, and the spheres includes the third layer with our spheres. Now I want to go to render settings here and go to film and check transparent. And when I go to the rendered viewport, you see this background Originally it had that color, but if we check transparent, everywhere where this background is, or the sky more or less, it adds transparency. So enable all 3 layers and we can render, I think. Yep. And make sure all 3 layers are active. And you see the ground plane with the shadows and the reflections. Now the cubes with a transparent background and the spheres. So now we'll actually go into the compositor with Shift F3 and you go to composing nodes, use nodes, and I see I pressed that already, and backdrop. And now we'll start the compositing and you will see in just a minute that there is a little problem, but we'll fix that in just a second. So the main concept or a rule of thumb for compositing is to start with the background and add on top until you're in the foreground. So add from the background to the foreground. In this case, our background is the floor. And then we have the 2 layers with the cubes and the spheres. You can't really tell there if it's the cube that is behind the spheres or the spheres are in front of the cubes or the other way around. We just know that these are in front of the floor plane. So we have to add them on top. In this case we can add, so I add with Shift A. In this case we can add an alpha overnode because there's some transparency in this render layer, and I added this sphere node with Control Shift left click, and by clicking and holding these 3 keys you can scrub through these passes or switch between the passes. And yeah, as I said, this has a transparent or transparency channel, so we can use an alpha overnode, and you have to plug the image of the transparency always on the bottom socket here. So now duplicate this with Shift D and add the spheres, and you see our little problem. And let's see, plug this into the compositor, and you see the little problem that the spheres are on top of the cubes, even though in the 3D viewport they were behind the cubes, except that sphere here. So maybe we missed the concept of adding from the background to the foreground. Let's try it, and you see it still doesn't work. Yeah, I think you can imagine the reason, and it's just like any normal image editor, that it has some layers. In this case these are layers and we add them on top, and it just overlays them, and Blender doesn't know that this part of the sphere here, so this part, is behind this cube, so we have to erase this part. To do that we go to spheres render layer and erase this part of this layer of this rendered image via this layer with the cubes on it. So you see mask layers, and we can select the layer with the cubes on it, and this basically, so Blender knows there are 4 cubes and there are spheres, and everywhere where is a cube in front of a sphere I have to add some transparency. Well, there is a cube and there's a sphere, but Blender notices that this sphere is in front of this cube, so it doesn't erase the sphere here, so it keeps the visibility as it should be. You could also select the cubes layer and use the spheres as a mask layer, but I wanna have the cubes as a mask layer. So again, this layer acts as a mask for this layer, or the other way around. This layer acts as a mask for this layer. So you could do both things. Enable ortho layers, so it actually renders them. In this case, we could save, or we could have saved some time by just rendering the layer with the spheres. But yeah, it doesn't take too long, so we can go ahead with this. So you see, now the visibility is right. The spheres have, or the layer with the spheres has some transparency here. You see the mask for the spheres. And when we add this on top, there in this area here, there isn't something added, so we see the cube like it should be. So now you saw Shift F3 for the compositor. Now you saw the floor had a bit of noise here. You see it's pretty noisy. And we could increase the samples over the whole image, or we just select the render layer and specify some custom or a custom value for the amount of samples for this render layer. So you see my sampling or my my amount of samples right now is 200. So I think we could add 200 more, so let's say 400 samples. And Blender always uses the value that's in here. So I could type in 1000 for the scene samples, which is this here. And it would render it with 400 samples. I could type in 0, not 0, sorry, that isn't possible. So I could type in 1 sample, for example. It would render this layer still as 400 samples. But when I just type in 0, it uses, it uses the scene samples. 400, so go into the compositor, where we are. And now press on this little camera here, and it only renders this render layer. So you don't see anything because we have to select that render layer. And now you see it renders with more samples. So I will cancel that now, because we have to re-render it in just a second. Because now imagine in our really super fancy feature film, the director, for example, decided to add a pretty strong light to the glass spheres here. But he won't, or he likes the look of the rest, so the cubes and the floor plane are lit perfectly. So you just want to affect the spheres. So let's duplicate this sun lamp and press Alt R to clear the rotation and make a pretty strong light out of it. So that's maybe a bit too much, so 15, maybe 10. Let's see how it looks like when you give it just a bit of color. Yeah, it works perfectly fine. But now you see the cubes are affected too. Well, there is functions for the render layers that says exclude. So move the lamp to a separate layer and enable this layer. And now we can tell Blender that it actually ignores this light for this render layer for the floor, and it ignores the light for the render layer with the cubes, but for the spheres it just renders it normally. So you could think of this like in the way it, whatever layer you define here, it simply disables it for the rendering for this render layer, and everything that, or when you disable a render layer, it isn't rendered at all. And this is basically how the exclude function works. And yeah, and on this render layer, or on this render layer, we rendered. So now press F12 for the, and now you see we have the normal floor with all the reflections, and now the cubes, which are exactly the same like before, but now the spheres have some pretty strong reflections from this sun lamp. So, and yeah, now imagine, or not imagine, now think that say the director again wants that the spheres have one uniform color, but he isn't sure if he likes it, so it should be just for one test render. So we could assign the same material for each sphere, so 009, and select it 009, or we could simply select a material here, 009 for example, and now all materials or all objects that are included in this render layer are rendered with the material you defined here. So press, let's see, no, just re-render. No, we have to re-render the whole scene because there are some reflections on the floor. And yeah, now you see a small problem that actually the reflections are the same. So it uses the reflections of the original materials, but yeah, it renders the objects on this layer with the material we defined here. So yeah, that's a bit of a problem. That's actually my or that's a mistake I made. But yeah, the director already gets idea what it would look like with this material. So, and now we are pretty much at the end. So yeah, there's 3 functions left. So say use environment. Let's say that we want to have some nice reflections on the floor. So say environment texture. Just open any random image. Multi-important sample. And again, we don't want to affect the cubes and the spheres. So we disable the environment, and actually now it will look a bit darker because the environment just gave a bit of lighting information, but now we should see some reflections here in the ground plane, and disable this material override function. Now see we get these reflections on the floor from this HDRI image, and the spheres aren't affected, or it should be the case. And yeah, now you see, or you saw, that the spheres are a bit dark here in these areas because when you uncheck use environment, it calculates it like a big black whatever space around the object, so there's absolute no lighting. So I would leave this checked in most of the cases. use surfaces. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's for surfaces like this. It would sound, or it sounds pretty obvious that it's that. But yeah, in some testings I did before, it wasn't that clear, so I'm not 100% sure. And use hair is like it says, so it uses particle hairs or not for this render layer. Yeah, I think that's basically it. So yeah, that will follow a tutorial for the render passes, and as well for the scene I showed you at the beginning. And yeah, so if you like this video, give me a thumb up, or if you want to see more videos or more video tutorials, subscribe to the YouTube channel down below. And yeah, I hope I see you in my next video, and have a nice time. Bye.